the way he's handled this call for people to show up in Istanbul for negotiations has been flat-footed, actually, because he put out the call, and then when it was answered yes by Zelensky, he couldn't answer yes in return. And so I think he has visibly irritated some on the American side by doing that. So I'm not sure he's as quite as deft as people think. Um, he's very, very set in his sort of dictatorial ways. I don't think he's listening to a lot of advice, and he's contemptuous of Zelensky and of Ukraine. And that's been rather exposed, I think, by the way Zelensky's been able to operate with advice from Starmer and Macron and others. So, I think the guy's got weaknesses, even in his manipulative, propagandistic kind of foreign policy.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Lord Peter Ricketts. Lord Ricketts has 40 years' experience as a British diplomat and was the UK's National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2012. Lord Ricketts, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you again.
Hello, Kate.
Now, from perhaps naive high hopes of head-to-head peace talks in Istanbul between President Zelensky and President Putin, we're down to delegations which have been derided by President Zelensky as theatrical. Was that idea of the Putin-Zelensky meeting ever realistic?
No, I don't think it was ever going to happen. I think it was a very smart move by Zelensky to move quickly to say, I'm going to go to Istanbul and I'll wait for you there, Putin. But Putin, to go and to put himself on equal status with someone who he's tried to kill for the last 3 years, whose country he's tried to wipe off the map, I mean, it would have been an incredible loss of face and prestige. And I don't think he was ever going to do it. So I think the Ukrainians neatly called Putin's bluff, and I hope have therefore kept themselves on side with Donald Trump.
Just for transparency, we're talking at 5 o'clock London time, and these meetings have not, if they do, have not taken place yet. Zelensky has said he's sending his defense minister to the talks, who'll be there with US and Turkish representatives. Putin has sent a delegation led by his aide Vladimir Medinsky. What does Medinsky tell us about Putin's strategy?
And I think Medinsky was also the person who was negotiating, so-called, was having the discussions in 2022, just before the invasion. So, I mean, he's an apparatchik. He's somebody out of Putin's staff. He would have zero authority to negotiate anything. He will have a script, no doubt, with demands, but he will have, no capacity to actually have a sensible discussion. So I think Zelensky's seen that quite rightly. He's sending a reliable ally of his own, and I think we can safely assume, as of now, that nothing very interesting will come out of this exchange. Partly because the two sides are talking completely past each other. I mean, while I think Zelensky genuinely wants a ceasefire on his own terms, I think the Russians are looking to open a whole area of debate which would lead, in their view, to Ukraine basically giving up most of what constitutes a sovereign country. They would want chunks of territory. They would want Ukraine never to join NATO, not to accept Western arms. So these are two completely different positions, and I don't think today in Istanbul they're going to be brought at all closer together.
And just looking at the wider Russian team that's being sent, what can we surmise from the choices? I mean, it's designed, I'm wondering whether it's designed for the Russian domestic audience or to be an insult to President Zelensky, if you take into account that it includes a Russian general who secured surrender during the siege of Mariupol and a woman reportedly responsible for the re-education of Ukrainian children.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a provocation. No doubt there's a certain element, as always with the Russians, of each of them watching each other to make sure that nobody says anything out of line. But yeah, it's absolutely not a serious negotiating team. It's a political gesture, no doubt, mainly for domestic consumption. And remember, this is a proposal that Putin himself made. After Western leaders had said, we want an immediate 30-day ceasefire, Putin's riposte was, well, let's sit down and have negotiations in Istanbul. Now that he's confronted with the reality of them, he sent basically a propagandizing team for domestic effect.
Do you think briefly that President Zelensky actually outmaneuvered Putin by saying, yes, I'll come?
I do. I do. I think it was a smart, deft piece of maneuver. I think probably supported by his British and French backers that put Putin on the back step and made Trump recognize that there's one side here that wants a ceasefire and the other side doesn't.
Is it fanciful, though, when you look at things as they are, that diplomacy can actually lead to a ceasefire at this moment in time?
Well, I think my basic position, I think, is that Ukraine will settle for ceasefire with the right conditions, and I don't think Putin is at all interested in a ceasefire. He still thinks he's moving forward on the battlefield. I think he's calculating that he can outlast Trump, that Trump's attention span is notoriously short. I mean, Trump will move on to other things, and Putin is hoping that he'll wash his hands of the whole Ukraine business, including support for Ukraine. And so he doesn't see any interest in a ceasefire now. Therefore, no, I don't think diplomacy is going to have any useful effect yet.
It all looked so different at the weekend, didn't it, in Kyiv, with Zelensky, Britain, France, Germany, and Poland meeting, Donald Trump joining on the phone. They call for this immediate ceasefire. They threaten new sanctions if it didn't happen. Why didn't they follow through on Monday, late Monday, when there was no sign of Putin holding to a ceasefire and instead proposing this meeting?
Well, I think partly because they've been trying to stay in step with Donald Trump. Um, and it was quite striking that Trump, at that point, basically told Zelensky in his social media post to get to Istanbul to the meeting, but he hasn't put similar pressure on Putin as well. So there's still a disproportionate approach here. I'm afraid Trump is still in the mindset of thinking that basically Zelensky is the guy in the weaker position, so he can be pushed around and ordered to do this and that. And Putin, there still seems to be a curious respect on Trump's side for Putin. You know, he hasn't been sending the same kind of threatening social media messages. However, I hope that by now Trump is getting impatient with Putin, who has never delivered on any of the initiatives that Trump has taken. And I think part of the game on the Western side is to make absolutely sure that as this breaks down, as I think it will, the blame lies squarely at Putin's door, and therefore the prospect perhaps of Trump accepting that it's time for more sanctions on the
So,
Russians.
so that meeting at the weekend, it was Europe's real big effort to design a framework for meaningful peace talks. It failed so far. What happens next, and how do you get them to put the pressure to unveil Putin for what he is in Trump's eyes?
I mean, I think it was the ceasefire proposal was more of a sort of political gambit to put the pressure on Putin, and in fact, it worked in the sense that Putin did not show up. I think the more important work going on at the weekend was in the background on what exactly the support package from the West would be for Ukraine, and that's part of the answer, actually, of finally moving this towards a day when the Russians will be willing to do some sort of deal, is to show that Ukraine is strong and that the risk that they'd be left abandoned by the Americans pulling out isn't going to happen. They were talking about more support from arms, some sort of air policing package, some sort of maritime support, and possibly some Western forces on the ground, although I'm less clear about what that would be in practice, all of which adds up to some quite significant security backing for Ukraine. And that's part of convincing Putin that he can't win this war.
Mm. When you take into account that talks of a ceasefire have been going on now, seriously, well, seriously, inverted commas, since the 11th of March, a lot of the analysis since has portrayed each side trying to frame the other as the obstacle to peace and curry favour with Trump. And you say you still have that hope that Trump may actually finally lose patience and see reason to put pressure on Putin. How close do you think that we are to that?
Heavens, I mean, nobody can read that guy's mind. He is very focused on getting deals, and he keeps hoping that there's going to be a quick deal, a quick ceasefire that he can take the credit for. And several times now he's proposed, let's move to a quick ceasefire. And each time Putin has showed he's not interested in a quick ceasefire for the reasons we've been talking about. So logically, he ought to conclude at some point that this guy Zelensky is up for it and Putin's not up for it, and that therefore Russia should be sanctioned. And there have been some signs, for example, from J.D. Vance talking at a European Security Conference in Washington before making the trip to Saudi Arabia, suggesting that the Americans are now beginning to run out of patience with Putin, that they do think he is asking for far too much and is not showing himself at all flexible. So yes, I don't rule out that Trump can flip and suddenly discover that Putin is the problem and sanctions him. He is so mercurial that that is not at all out of the question, I think.
But isn't part of the problem also the fact that there is no coherent message coming from Trump's diplomatic team?
Yes, absolutely. And his diplomatic team, that's a polite way of putting it, very frankly, Kate. His chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, is a property tycoon and a golfing partner of Trump. He seems to have been given the entire world, all the world's problems to solve. He's trying to deal with Iran, with Gaza, as well as Ukraine. Marco Rubio is a very inexperienced, although very sensible Secretary of State. The Defense Secretary is an amateur, so this is not a strong team. And I don't get the impression that there are many State Department professionals working with them, and so they are tending to go. They're living hour by hour. They're living breaking news flash by another. I don't see any real settled strategy here, and so yes, it's a competition uh, from each side to gain their attention and to convince them, in the short term that that they're more positive. They offer America more. That's why that minerals deal that Zelensky signed, I think, was important. But it's frankly not a professional team, and therefore the British and French in supporting Zelensky have to keep trying to keep things on track, and also I think keep the White House on track, and to see what is really important here.
And what about Donald Trump's wider foreign policy and diplomacy? What have we learned from his first big trip of his presidency to the Middle East?
That it's all about America first. And indeed Trump first, because there's been quite a lot of business done around the margins for the Trump business concerns as well. It's about deals that are of benefit to the US economically, and that's really, I think, what Trump's international policy comes down to. Everything else is secondary. What is in it for the Americans? And of course, the Gulf countries are extremely well placed to play towards that. They can offer these hundreds of billions of dollars worth of contracts. Whether any of them actually, all of them actually emerge, we'll see. They can offer him jumbo jets and so on in a way that democracies can't do. So this plays absolutely to what Trump enjoys. But I think the characteristics we've seen are that are very mercantile, very commercially focused on America, short attention span, impatience for immediate, big, shiny deals, and a willingness to move on if they're not getting them. And I think the Gaza crisis is a bit of an example of that.
And travelling on Air Force One today, Donald Trump told reporters that nothing is going to happen on Ukraine ceasefire talks until he and Putin get together. But so far, has anything good come out of it for Ukraine when they do?
No, not yet. I mean, the worst has been avoided. The worst would have been an American cut-off of economic support, military support, intelligence. That's been avoided, at least for now. I mean, it's a classic Trump remark that nothing happens unless I'm around. And maybe it's true that only Trump could get Putin to come somewhere for a discussion. But as I was saying earlier, the problem is that two sides are starting from completely different positions. And a bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin would be fraught with danger because then all his instincts would be to try and cut a deal with Putin. So if there is going to be a meeting involving Trump, it has to have Zelensky there as well to make sure that the other side of the argument is being put.
And do you think also that European leaders should be stepping up and putting more pressure on to have their voices heard?
Well, actually, I think they've been doing pretty well. I mean, I think that meeting last weekend was an example of how they met together in Norway, but they were talking to Donald Trump on the phone as well. I hope, therefore, they were coordinating what they were going to say publicly. And the whirlwind of international meetings goes on. There's a NATO foreign ministers meeting going on while we speak, where the Secretary of State Marco Rubio is attending. There's also a European political summit happening in Tirana in Albania. And so there's a blizzard of things going on. And I think the European side, Starmer and Macron particularly, have been pretty good at managing to keep Trump at least up to date with what's going on, avoiding surprises and avoiding the most unhelpful kind of social media reactions. But it's an hour by hour struggle, I think.
And in Turkey itself, we know that the Ukrainians met with Turkey's President Erdogan earlier today, and that the Russian delegation were planning on this too. How much weight does an external mediator like Turkey have? One, incidentally, of course, which supports Crimea being Ukrainian.
Yes, I think Erdogan has placed himself rather cleverly as everyone's friend, and it's been a bit of a bonanza day for him. He's also recently had the Kurdish separatist movement, the PKK, declaring an end to their struggle. I think he was also pressing Trump to meet Mr. Sharar, the new leader of Syria. So he's had wins on a number of fronts, and this sort of managing to be both in NATO and also keep his lines open to Putin. I mean, that tactic is playing off. One of the strengths he has, of course, on Ukraine is that he controls the Bosphorus Straits and he can prevent Russian warships coming in and out of the Bosphorus, and therefore cutting, the Russian Black Sea Fleet off from the Mediterranean. That's an important strategic asset he has, and therefore he is in a position to be pretty influential.
Mm. Are there any other political heavyweights who've arrived in Turkey, be it for the NATO foreign ministers meeting or otherwise, who we should be watching right now for what they do and what they say? I'm thinking perhaps Lindsey Graham apparently is around as well.
Right. I mean, Turkey is really the centre of diplomacy at the moment, and that's a very interesting mix of people. But no, I think you've named the main ones. Recognizing also that the European leaders are in Tirana, so they're all collectively there. So if there was a will to get people together, have a serious Russia-Ukraine negotiation with Erdogan sort of holding the ring, using the fact that Marco Rubio is in Turkey, the political leaders of Europe are in Tirana, you could orchestrate something that moved very quickly. But the core of that would be some sort of basis for a discussion between the two sides, which I simply don't see.
Broadening it out, a new report on addressing the wider threat posed by Russia, the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, it says it could be ready to attack NATO countries within 2 years if the US brokers a ceasefire deal for Ukraine in the next few months, for example. And that aligns with earlier warnings by NATO leaders. Do you believe that Russia is planning, or if not planning, considering war with NATO?
No, I don't. I honestly think that's going too far. I think the discussion there is about capability rather than intention. I think Putin's got enough on his plate, more than enough on his plate at the moment. He's got a war in Ukraine that he's not been able to bring to an end after 3 years and massive losses. And these sort of calculations that if the war stopped, he would continue war production at the same rate and he would reconstitute his army and be ready to go back into action in 2 or 3 years feel to me to be exaggerated. I mean, it's quite right that the West should be absolutely alive to the risk of a hostile Russia sharing our continent for the future. But there's been an enormous political and economic cost in Russia from this war. The number of lives they've lost, perhaps up to 1 million people killed or badly wounded, massive economic damage, the whole Russian economy twisted out of shape to be a war economy. I mean, all of that takes its toll. And I think that while they may aim for a capability, the idea of taking on NATO, it seems to me to be improbable in the immediate future. But I certainly agree that if the Americans are to pull out a lot of the key military assets they keep in Europe, troops, but also some of the very expensive equipment they have here, it would take the Europeans years to replace that. And in that gap between the Americans going and the Europeans being really up to the same level of strength, there is a risk of Putin trying some sort of adventure, perhaps not within the next 2 years, but within the next five. I think nobody could rule that out.
And deterrence is the key, isn't it? And it has been suggested if Putin were to try something, he'd start by testing Article 5, the principle that a strike on one, attack on one is an attack on all, collective defence. How would you see that happening if it were to happen?
Yes, I mean, and deterrence, of course, depends on trust. That we all trust that particularly the Americans, but other allies would come to the support of any ally who was attacked. And the answer is, I think he would probably try something in the Baltic states, testing NATO resolve there. There are Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic states, so he could engineer some sort of uprising there, or that kind of grey area threat, and see how NATO responded to it. Of course, we, the British, have troops in Estonia. Other NATO members have troops also forward deployed in the Baltic states. So very quickly, we would have to be thinking about some form military, increasing our military defence for the Baltic states. That's the kind of flashpoint that might occur. But I still think that a direct head-on military collision with NATO is not likely, although it's something, of course, we need to plan and prepare for.
What do you think the most likely turn of events is to be in the coming months? Do you think that the war is simply going to continue?
I fear so. I'd like to sit and tell you that peace is going to break out in Ukraine in the coming weeks and months. And Donald Trump will carry off the trophy. I mean, I honestly don't see that. I do think the grinding, grueling war is going to go on for a reason I mentioned earlier. That I think Putin is trying to outweight the West. I think he knows Trump's attention span is short. I mean, he must see the signs now that Europe is serious about rearming, but he knows that's going to take time. There are many other calls on public spending in all our countries, and I think he thinks he can be more resilient. He can wait it out, and in the end, he can still come out of this war with something that he can represent to the Russian people as a success. And as long as that's true, he will keep going, and the Ukrainians will keep fighting.
I'm really interested to get your professional view. I mean, over and over again, we see instances of Putin's sleight of hand, his ability to diplomatically outmaneuver his adversaries. How do you deal with that?
Well, actually, I don't think he's been all that smart in the last few days. I mean, I would have agreed with you, and over the first couple of years of the war, his military situation was bad, but his diplomacy was quite deft. The way he's handled this call for people to show up in Istanbul for negotiations has been flat-footed, actually, because he put out the call, and then when it was answered yes by Zelensky, he couldn't answer yes in return, and so I think he has visibly irritated some on the American side by doing that. So I'm not sure he's as quite as deft as people think. Um, he's very, very set in his sort of dictatorial ways. I don't think he's listening to a lot of advice, and he's contemptuous of Zelensky and of Ukraine. And that's been rather exposed, I think, by the way Zelensky's been able to operate with advice from Starmer and Macron and others. So, I think the guy's got weaknesses, even in his manipulative, propagandistic kind of foreign policy.
And at this moment in time, then, how does President Zelensky take advantage of that?
Well, I think he keeps close to his Western allies. I think he keeps making the case to Trump that the way to keep America safe in the longer run is for Ukraine to come out of this as an independent, pro-Western country, rich in minerals and other assets, and therefore it's in America's interest to keep supporting Ukraine. I think he's made some progress in that direction since that awful Oval Office crash of a couple of months ago, but it's work of every day.
And at this moment, of course, we still don't know exactly what will or will not happen in Istanbul, nor the consequences. And this is a process which started, as I said earlier, on the 11th of March. 40 years in diplomacy yourself. Does this compare remotely to anything you've ever experienced in your career?
No, I think this is a roller coaster ride of a kind I can't remember. I mean, we've had shuttle diplomacy before, we've had Henry Kissinger shuttling around the Middle East, or Richard Holbrooke around the Balkans before the Dayton Conference. But there was always a stronger American grip on the process and an American willingness to focus their economic and their military muscle in order to get things over the line. It's much more chaotic and random at this point, and therefore I think it's been less successful. And without a really successful professional American negotiating team at the heart, things keep going wrong. So we're in uncharted territories, certainly from my experience.
Lord Ricketts, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.